Hello, Cadre. This is a brief video that I want to use to emphasize and clarify the role of the federal government, state government, local government in policy and politics in schools. Touched on a little bit through the presentations that have been made, but I wanted to make sure it's absolutely clear how that relationship actually works. The federal government's role in local education has been evolving for some time. Historically, up until about 20 years ago, the federal government basically provided funds earmarked for certain categories of things that they wanted to see done, which were basically equity issues, like Public Law 94-142, or what we now know as IDEA. Special education was an example. Career and technical education is another example. Safe and drug-free schools, Title I. Basically provided funding, and for the most part, the accountability in those programs was simply reporting how the money was spent, what it was used for, the number of students involved, and so forth. Well, back in the early 90s, that started to change. In fact, it was part of Title I for a long time, but no one paid much attention to it. That basically the same kind of accountability that eventually was outlined under No Child Left Behind had already been there for some time under Title I, and but had not been strictly enforced by the federal government, nor was it followed by most of the schools. In fact, I was quite surprised that that was there until we basically had a meeting with the feds over No Child Left Behind, and they were outlining and showing us the Title I regulations. Well, it started to change with that. That was a catalyst to it, but there are a number of other things that were building. For example, it had been building for some time the idea or notion that if you couldn't resolve an issue at a local level, you moved up to the next level, which would have been the state. If you couldn't resolve an issue at the state level, you moved on up to the federal level. And as a result, all of a sudden, the representatives in Congress, our representatives and our senators, were getting all kinds of requests to do certain things that people simply couldn't get done either at the local level or at the state level. And in fact, No Child Left Behind was quite a bit of a product of that very thing. Second thing, there was a growing sense that if you're going to receive federal money, you're going to have to be accountable for outcomes or results, not just what you did, the processes that you went through, but there had to be an outcome, and that outcome was determined to be student learning, which translated into test scores, essentially. And so that was growing at the same time. Then when the notion of No Child Left Behind came along, a lot of people didn't think it had much of a chance of passing that first time around, but if you remember 9/11, the attack in New York City on the World Trade Center, that was a huge catalyst to having No Child Left Behind actually get codified at that time, because it was a way for the country to kind of get back to its business, to begin to heal itself. And historically, when you think about a lot of those catastrophes like that, the people turned to the schools and education to solve those problems. Way back in the times of the Great Depression, there were more adults engaged in higher education per capita than any other time in our history. And there were lots of opportunities to take college courses, to get college degrees, and then the GI Bill came along, and the GI Bill provided opportunities for post-secondary education for every veteran that fought in Korea, World War II, Korea, and then of course Vietnam and post-Vietnam kinds of things. And so that was a catalyst as well. But basically the catalyst behind No Child Left Behind was this huge coalition that people didn't realize were forming out of this, one, frustration with the local and state levels in resolving problems. Secondly, this growing group of people who felt they weren't being served at all in our nation's schools. And that was the Black Coalition, the Black Caucus. In fact, gifted parents were part of that coalition, parents of special education students or students with disabilities. Lots of Title IX kinds of advocates were involved in that, and so this huge coalition started to form. And then you put into the mix the need to find an accountability system, that was pulled into it as well. And so as a result, there was a tremendous bipartisan support for No Child Left Behind. That really didn't have anything to do with being bipartisan. It had to do with this accumulation of one thing after another and one on top of the other. And basically No Child Left Behind was framed and voted on in that year, and it did surprise everyone. I think had it not been for 9/11, we probably would have been able to discuss No Child for another session of Congress, and may have been able to make some at least minor changes in how that was going to operate. But it became a very heavy-handed kind of operation for the feds. Well, what is the real authority of the federal government to be engaged in local schools and local education and state education? There is no provision in the federal Constitution for their involvement in education. In fact, it says in the federal Constitution, those matters not explicitly mentioned in that Constitution are rights that are reserved for the states. In other words, education was a state responsibility, not a federal one. Well, what then justified or rationalized things like the IDEA, the Title IX, Title I, Safe and Drug-Free Schools? Well, those were all basically equity kinds of bills, trying to serve populations that were either underserved, not being served, or needed to be served, and so forth. And those bills were all contested by different people, saying, especially No Child Left Behind. There were several states that framed lawsuits around the constitutionality of No Child Left Behind, saying, under what authority does the federal government, who only puts in about, at that time, 6 to 7% of the total cost of local education, what gives them then the authority to take over 100% of the accountability of local schools? Well, it comes under, those lawsuits didn't go anywhere because there is a provision in the Constitution called the General Welfare Clause. So if the federal government can make the case that a particular policy proposal serves the general welfare of the people, it has the right to get into that. That's a tricky kind of thing for them to use because you have to balance this general welfare clause against the Constitution, which says that education is a state function, and yet that was the foundation for it through the General Welfare Clause. The kinds of impacts that No Child Left Behind had on schools, basically prior to that, the relationship looked something like this. 3 triangles, the local triangle at the bottom with the Board of Education, the superintendent, the principals, the teachers, then the state triangle with the governor, the legislature, the Department of Education, the commissioner, and so forth, and then the federal government, the president, Congress, U.S. Department of Education, and so forth. Really barely touching each other, not a great deal of what you'd call interference. In fact, the federal government saw itself as more as a helping agency, that it could write checks, provide money and funds for states to do what they needed to do. And yet there was a growing time prior to 1990 through the late 70s, early 80s, where the federal government was getting more hyperactive about their involvement and saying, you know, we need to do more than just write checks and send money. Well, one of the notions that was also building that caused No Child Left Behind and its children, so to speak, that came along was this notion that if you're going to take federal money, you're going to be accountable for it. And one of the arguments that I always made with our federal colleagues was that there really is no such thing as federal money. Federal government does not have money. It is a trustee of money that is paid to it by local people. And I didn't have a problem being accountable to local people in our schools and communities, but I did have a great deal of problem being accountable to the federal government, other than reporting how we were going to be spending, or how we did, in fact, spend our money. Because it should have been the state that set the goals and priorities in those programs of IDEA, Title I, Safe and Drug-Free Schools, and so forth. But the impact of that was huge, and it looks something like this, and I hope you can see this. I kind of sketched it out. It caused one layer of government to fall down over the top and basically blur what was going on there. So for example, the federal government, basically its triangle pushed down over the top of the state triangle, usurping the role that the governor had, basically usurping also the role of the legislature, and the Nebraska Department of Education was also pinched by that. And then that triangle was pushed down over the top of the local triangle, where the board, the superintendent, basically were displaced in that process, and their job was primarily then to carry out the rules and regulations of the state. The state was there to primarily carry out the rules and regulations of the federal government. So the impact of that is still there, and if you talk to any superintendent right now or Board of Education member who was a Board of Education member 15, 20 years ago, they will tell you that they have a whole lot less discretion than they used to have. The feds or the state people will tell you the same thing. The governor, the legislature, the State Department will say they have a lot less leeway and discretion than they had 20 years ago, simply because the role of the federal government that became horribly hyperactive over No Child Left Behind, and some of the frustration that people in Washington had with the pace of change or the kinds of change that was going on at the local level. Well, the state constitution, such as the state of Nebraska or any other state, they have some version of the state is responsible for the education of all citizens from age 5 to age 21. That's what it says in the statutes in Nebraska, and that education is supposed to be free and appropriate, and it's supposed to be a public education system. Well, in addition to the Constitution, the legislature plays a key role in most states. In fact, many of the states the legislature is far more hyperactive than the Nebraska legislature, and I know some of you find that a little bit difficult to believe, but they are. And basically, whenever the state legislature, like in Nebraska, for example, decides it's going to promulgate a law that requires schools to do something, it basically says we want schools to do X, and we hereby direct the State Department of Education or the Nebraska Department of Education and State Board to put this in place. An example, when multicultural education law passed some time ago, 10, 12 years ago, it directed the State Department to put in place multicultural education, where the contributions of those four named groups was to become embedded and integrated into the curriculum of the schools. And so then the initial rules and regulations were part of Rule 10. Excuse me. In order to be an accredited school, you had to have a multicultural education program, and that had to be part of what you demonstrated to be meeting the minimum standards of accreditation. The third level of authority is at the local level, and basically the local level has no authority to do anything that it isn't directed to do or specifically named that it can do in the Constitution or in the statutes. In other words, school districts can own and operate buses because it says in the statutes that they can. They can hire a superintendent because it says in the statutes that they can. They can provide for school lunch programs because it says in the statutes that they can.